Ambassador Vivek, Katju, thanks for speaking to us. This reduction of violence, or whether you want to call it a partial ceasefire, 7-day ceasefire, is it a significant breakthrough in your mind after what, 14, 15 months of talks?
Let's go back to September. The reason that Trump had given when he pulled out of these talks and
U.S. troop.
Exactly. So
They've been 6 this year.
They've been 6. So I think in Trump's mind, it's important to ensure that that kind of an embarrassment, quote unquote, does not happen again. And hence, he's asking for some assurances from the Taliban that there will be no repetition of what had happened in September, which was an attack of on American forces, which had led to casualties, even one casualty. So I see it in that perspective.
So it's only foreign troops, American troops, they continue attacks against the Afghans?
I think that's a little unclear. The report suggests that the Americans want the Taliban not to attack any forces and not to carry out any violence. But we really have to wait and watch, because the Taliban, certainly to my mind, cannot give an assurance that they'll never attack any Afghan forces. For the simple reason that if they do this, then they would be apprehensive that their rank and file, or much of it, may just simply melt away. Because it is not a regular army. These are people who are committed to the Taliban cause, but not to an extent that if there is no fighting to be done, then they'll remain, because we know the Afghan system. If there is fighting to be done, people are there. If there's no fighting to be done, they go back to their villages. So I do think that it would be too much to expect that the Taliban would agree on a permanent ceasefire, something that, of course, the Americans would like very much ideally, and something also that the Afghan political class, the non-Taliban political class wants.
Different nomenclatures, ceasefire versus reduction in violence, who it's against. Your reading of this diplomatic posturing in these negotiations?
The word ceasefire had acquired a certain connotation, and the Taliban certainly didn't like to give an assurance that there will be that there will be a ceasefire, because their main hold is their ability to inflict violence. If they lose that ability, then one of the principal pillars on which their power rests will go. So I think they are shrewd enough, and perhaps also under Pakistani pressure, to agree to some kind of diminishing of violence.
And which is measurable? Is that what they'll be
I
looking at,
don't
the
know.
Americans?
I don't know. The Americans, of course, like everything quantified. But one doesn't know whether that will happen. What I've read is that they're giving signals that there won't be attacks in urban areas because they're very eye-catching.
No suicide car bombs, but nothing about IEDs because they may already have been planted. They can't guarantee that.
So one doesn't know. The interesting thing is that the principal points on which there have been these discussions ever since the Taliban Khalilzad engagement began have not changed. There were 4, if you recollect.
Yeah, 4 pillars.
The first was assurances which the Americans needed that there will be no terrorism against American interests, particularly from territories under Taliban control. I think that the Taliban have given them. What the Americans would want is some kind of monitoring mechanism that nothing is brewing. And there would be some understandings reached on that. So that's one point. The second was of a ceasefire. The second was on reduction of American troops. Now, on that, at one stage it had seemed that the troop levels would come down to around 3,000 and it will be training missions, etc. Today, there is some talk that I've seen of a troop level 600, exactly, 8,600, and that this would include a CT, counter-terrorism role. So that's something which will have to be negotiated between the Taliban and the Americans, and it will not be easy.
Because the Taliban clearly, their principal aim is to get all foreign troops out. So how do they agree to something?
That is what they have said. Now there's some talk I've seen that there are secret understandings which will be there, will reduce to paper. Whenever there is a dichotomy between what one side is claiming and what it has agreed to in a secret piece of paper, there are problems. So this is one issue which we'll have to keep in mind. The third point was a ceasefire. And on that, I think some kind of finessing is being attempted through these terms. But in the principal element is, will there be violence? Are the Taliban willing to lay down their arms, which obviously they are not?
Like the Afghans are saying, what, from 40 you bring it down to 35 killed a day? Is that what a reduction in violence is? People are still being killed.
So therefore there's a great deal of confusion, because when these negotiations, such negotiations which have taken place in other parts of the world, then forces are quarantined. Obviously that's not what's being talked about. The Americans are not telling the Taliban that you get your people, they'll remain in certain areas, confined to certain areas. The government forces will be confined to other areas. There will be international monitoring mechanisms to ensure that people are not going out of these areas, and therefore it's a true ceasefire. That's not what's being talked about.
Not at all.
So it's going to be a fairly unsatisfactory situation. And the last point was negotiations between the Taliban
and
the Afghans. That's totally blurred at the moment. So what we are coming back to is an agreement between the Taliban and the Americans on the 2 points which both sides are really interested in. The Americans want assurances on terrorism, and the Taliban want some kind of assurances on withdrawal of forces.
And you see the Taliban formally delinking themselves from groups like the Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani group. Haqqani is our number 2 military commander in the Taliban.
The Haqqani is part of the Taliban family, so to speak.
Al-Qaeda?
Now with Al-Qaeda, let's go back to fundamentals. The Taliban, when they began, they were not linked to any group like the Al-Qaeda. Let's not forget that Osama bin Laden came to Afghanistan in the summer of 1996 from the Sudan, if I recollect correctly. And it is at that stage that gradually intimacy and cooperation developed between Osama bin Laden and Mullah Umar. And when there was pressure mounted on Mullah Umar to abandon the Taliban, to abandon Al-Qaeda, he refused to do so. I think partly because of the kind of cooperation that was taking place, which I'm sure had a financial aspect too, and partly because of old Pashtun traditions. They're very strong. And he went to the extent of saying that, look, if you want to try him in a group of Islamic ulama can be called. Now, all that was, of course, eyewash. No one could have accepted that. So, on the Al-Qaeda bit, I'm quite willing to accept the proposition that the Taliban will not have a difficulty in almost eliminating their ties with the Al-Qaeda, certainly not allowing it to intrude, these ties to intrude in their relationship with the Americans.
If this contours which are being still worked out go through, do you see the U.S. and Taliban first, after this period of say 7 days ceasefire and monitoring for another week maybe, signing between these two negotiating parties, then like it happened in September, the Taliban were willing to talk to an intra-Afghan group in 2 weeks, and that progressing, is that, I mean, we're basically back to square one where we were in September before Donald Trump stopped the talks?
I do think yes. Because Kabul is in complete confusion. The Taliban, it seems, are cohesive when it comes to these aspects of negotiations, whereas there's no cohesion in the Kabul political class, if I may call it so. President Ghani had hoped that through these elections he'll be able to stamp his authority and show that he is in charge, and that the Taliban, if they have to deal with anyone, it will have to be with him, and that the negotiating team will bear his stamp. The elections haven't been formalized.
5 months, nowhere near. The IEC and the Complaints Commission are fighting among themselves. There's no clarity on that.
Even if the IEC formally declare results that Ghani has won in the first round, will that be accepted? So now there is some talk that the national unity government must continue till all this period is over. Which is why right through these many months, I have all been skeptical about this election process. I know that there were certain colleagues and our own Afghan experts who felt that no, the elections were very important. What have they yielded?
The number of people who voted, such a small percentage. I get your point there. But if Imran Khan and Pakistan can portray any kind of deal that happens as them forcing the Taliban onto the table or bringing the Taliban on the table, you think, given Donald Trump's election year, that he will then re-tilt back towards Pakistan when it comes to India?
No. I think the Americans want to dehyphenate this relationship, and they've done that. That's the India-Pakistan relationship. And they've done that for certainly for more than a decade. Yes, he'll be grateful to Pakistan, and that gratitude may be shown through lifting of economic pressures, through a better defense relationship, through lifting of all this FATF, getting them off the grey list. That seems to be more likely to me than trying to sort of hyphenate the relationship again, etc. Trump wants India, to my mind, Trump wants India to remain engaged in Afghanistan because India is a major player in this region, and India's absence from engagement would not be, to my mind, in American interests. The Americans know that in the 1990s, India, along with Iran and Russia, had helped in maintaining a certain balance in preventing the Taliban from sweeping through. And even though it was a difficult situation, I think diplomatically we were able to safeguard our interests, our
I want to ask
national
you a little
interests.
bit more about their engagement, but I want to also bring up, if you look at this timing, they talk of maybe signing the deal if all the conditions are met within 2 weeks. 24th, 25th is when President Trump comes to India. Do you think he'll be involved in the signing possibly? Because that's about the
I
same
don't
period.
see President Trump really going to Doha. There'll be an enormous concession. Now, with having said that, I'm conscious that with President Trump, no predictions can be made but conventionally, I would think that President Trump wouldn't like to really be in Doha because that is.
At one point in time, we had agreed to host them in Camp
That is
David.
different. That is where you are asking them to come. He is the big boss in Camp David. He's calling them, so they are coming to his territory. But going to Doha is a neutral place.
And Taliban made it clear that they wanted in international presence. So they're going to be calling other.
Well, yes, I mean, there can be an audience there, there can be other players, and when this agreement is signed. But that can be at a low level. In fact, if I recollect correctly, the Taliban was saying, we'll sign an agreement and then we'll come to Camp David.
And when you're talking about India's engagement, now we've also reported on the fact that top levels in the U.S. and India, the U.S. had requested for Indian boots on the ground in Afghanistan. And when you see the Trump and Modi meetings, somehow they don't talk about Afghanistan because he's also, the government is clearly aware of what Trump could do. So, and he said it before. I mean, why should we be thousands of miles away when you are on the doorstep there? But India's so far been absolutely clear that there will be no boots on the ground in combat role. But reports still suggesting, like you were saying, of so-called Afghan experts saying that India should.
No, I was talking of
I know,
experts
I know.
on the elections.
I know, but there also Afghan so-called experts have been saying that Indian boots should be on the ground.
Yes, I've seen some comments by some members of our security class suggesting that India should have boots on the ground. I think that would be a mistake, to put it mildly.
You're being diplomatic here.
It will give Pakistan an enormous opportunity to complicate things for us. We are on a good wicket in Afghanistan. To be frank, I think the government needs to do a little bit of diplomacy and outreach on the CAA issue. It has caused eyebrows to be raised, and if any negatives have come about because of that, I think those negatives need to be addressed. And I'm sure our diplomats are capable of addressing them. But apart from that, for the last 2 decades, the Afghan people have a good feeling about India. But the moment you put soldiers on the ground with maybe very noble intentions, and even as part of a UN force, you change the dynamics. And I would certainly not suggest that, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't proceed with our strategic partnership and have a more intense engagement in the security sector. There are many ways you can do that, through supplies, through training, and our role in these aspects has been appreciated by the Afghans. And so we should continue with that. And I'm also confident that if and when an interim authority or some kind of a joint authority, the Taliban and others, is formed, they too would be happy with contacts and intense contacts in the security sector from going on.
Ambassador Katju, again, it's always been a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thanks.